In this demo, we're going to get started with validation by showing you the easiest form of validation to use, and that's using exceptions. Starting point for this demo and the rest of the demos in this module is a simple WPF project. It's got an empty main window at this point. The only thing in the main window is a collection view source that's going to be working with a customer type. In the code behind the main window, we've got the window loaded event hooked up to go ahead and access that customer view source and just put an empty customer object into that collection. And the customer object we'll be dealing with in this demo is just a simple form of customer. It's got three properties at this point. It's got a home phone, a work phone, and a cell phone. And you can see it's just implementing the iNotify property change on that entity type. So that's our starting point. Let's go ahead and add a couple of fields to our main window to start doing some validation. So I'm going to drag out the work phone and home phone fields to generate two input fields, and we won't worry about layout here. Now, if you remember from the data sources window demos in a previous module, when we do that drag drop, because we already had this collection view source here, it didn't generate a new one. It just set the data context on the two grids that it generated. You can see one grid for one field, one grid for the other field. It sets the data context on the grid to the customer view source, and then on the data input field, it added the binding to the appropriate field. Now, as we talked about before, when you do these drag and drops, it adds some of these other properties relative to validation. You can see by default, it's going to turn on validates on exceptions equals true. The notify on validation error we'll get to later in the module. I'll take that off for now, as well as the mode equals two-way, which we covered in a previous module, is not needed on input controls in WPF. So we're going to focus on this home phone field for now. In fact, I'm going to take the validates on exceptions off for now so that I can first show what the default behavior of bindings is when there are exceptions. So let's drop back to the customer here and add a little helper method to validate a phone number. This method's going to take in a value and it's going to use a regular expression, which you don't have to read through that regular expression, but it's looking for a standard 3 digits, 4 digits kind of format like a US phone number. And if it doesn't match, it's going to throw an exception, an argument exception in this case, with an error string of invalid phone format. So now all we need to do is go to our home phone property, and after we see if the value coming in is different from the one we currently have, we can invoke our validate phone method, passing in the value. So one of the advantages of using exceptions for validation is that you can prevent the value from ever getting stored in your entity object if it's not a valid value. So if we run with this right now, and I've got the output window up at the bottom, note that as I put in an invalid phone number, something like ABC, and tab out of the field, you can see some first chance exceptions happening at the bottom. That's because by default, a binding will swallow any exceptions raised when it calls the set and get block. And it prevents your application from blowing up if it can't evaluate the property that it's pointed to. But in this case, we want that exception to indicate that there's a validation error. So I'm going to go back to my binding and put back on validates on exceptions equals true. Now if we run the same scenario, we go ahead and put in an invalid value and tab out of the field. Now we can see there's a red box around the control. So WPF controls by default have a built-in error template that simply puts a red box around the control. Now that's generally not enough information for the user because they don't know exactly what's wrong with that error, and you probably want to tell them what the error message was associated with the validation error. We'll get to how you can display those things later in this module. But for now, you can see that it has gone into an invalid state, and it will remain in that state until we put a valid value in, such as this number, and tab out of the field, and the red box goes away. So validating based on exceptions requires nothing more than in the set block of the property that's going to be set, invoke some logic that goes and decides whether the value is valid, and throws an appropriate exception if not.